I am David Carmichael, the Director of the State Archives, and on behalf of the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission, and most especially the State Archives, I want to welcome you to the annual Archives and Records Management Seminar. We're glad you attended, or you are attending. I don't want to put that in past tense yet. I hope that you're going to find it very well worth your time. We've worked hard to make that happen. Before we begin, I wanted to take just a moment, and it's really just a moment, to update you on the new State Archives facility. At this morning's session, I updated everyone on the digital archives progress and on the State Record Center software. So if you are interested in those, please check out the recording from this morning. But many of the people in this session have expressed interest in the last few years in the new archives building, so I wanted to just give you a quick update on where we are. If you are from the Harrisburg area and have driven down 6th Street lately, you will have noticed a lot of construction activity. The federal courthouse is going up. There's a very large new traffic circle being built right there. And in my very biased opinion, the most beautiful construction project of them all is the new State Archives facility that is just booming along. We spent several years in the design phase and finally got to the construction phase just as the pandemic struck. I admit I was somewhat worried at that point, but I have to give great credit to the Department of General Services and to the various contractors, because despite the pandemic, the building is largely on schedule at the moment. It's not entirely, but it is pretty close to being on schedule. And so far, we have not experienced major delays because of supply chain problems, knock on wood with me there. If that continues to be the case, then we expect to move into the new building next year by late summer or the fall. So there are likely to be some disruptions between now and then in archival services in particular, especially as we get close to that move time. And we are trying very hard to minimize the impact of any disruptions. So we will keep everybody very informed on our website and through emails about what we're doing. I have calculated, by the way, that moving the State Archives is the equivalent of moving a 3-bedroom house about 78 times. As someone who has moved many times, that just makes me shudder when I think about it. But we've been preparing for years for this move, and there's still a lot of move prep activity going on. So we are very excited about the prospects over the next year. We hope you'll get a chance to see the construction, and more importantly, come and visit us once we are reopened. We're still open here in our old building, but once we reopen in the new, come and see the new building. All right, so on that, after that brief update, let's get to our main program, which is the real reason you're here. And to do that, I'm going to turn you over to Dominique Luster, who is formerly of the Carnegie Art Museum in Pittsburgh, but now the owner of the Luster Company, an independent archives consulting company, and she's a great friend to the Pennsylvania State Archives and to archives everywhere. So Dominique, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. Wow, what kind words. Thank you all and welcome. You are welcome in being here today. We're really excited to be sharing with you. And I'm so excited to get started with our program and introduce our speakers. We have an amazing program set up for you today, and I cannot wait for all of us to get started. So first, again, thank you for being here. My name is Dominique Luster. I'm of the Luster Company in Richmond, Virginia, and I am pleased and honored and overwhelmed to be here with my colleagues that I will now introduce in order. And then I will invite each of them to give their presentation. So first, I'd like to introduce Cara Holtree-Curtis, who has been working in libraries since her undergraduate days. She has completed a master's degree in applied history and a master's of library and information science. She previously helped create a digital library of slavery and abolition texts in a joint project between Dickinson College and Millersville University. Since 2008, Cara has been working as the Archives and Library Director at the Cumberland County Historical Society. She is working to create more inclusive collections and histories at Cumberland County Historical Society And beyond preserving local history, her main goal is to make history more accessible to the public. We will be hearing from her first. Second, I will invite Ms. Jane Nutter to present. Ms. Jane Nutter was born and raised in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Her family has lived in Gettysburg since the mid-1800s with a long family history of educators and social justice advocates. Ms. Nutter worked for over 40 years in child and family development within her community and on local and state and national levels. Her work experience includes teaching, training, organizational development, supervisory roles with oversight of seven child care facilities, as well as an advocate for children and families. Her advocacy for early childhood education and for underserved populations has been her lifelong vocation. Ms. Nutter is currently the president of the Gettysburg Black History Museum, Incorporated, and sits on the board of the Adams County Historical Society. As president of the Gettysburg Black History Museum, Incorporated, she, along with a very committed board members, are dedicated to preserving, educating, and inspiring folks about Gettysburg Black history, American history, in our words. Her vision is to have a brick and mortar Gettysburg Black History Museum in Gettysburg. And then finally, but certainly not least, we look forward to welcoming Andrew Dalton. Andrew Dalton has served as executive director of the Adams County Historical Society since 2019. Prior to his appointment, Andrew completed his undergraduate studies at Gettysburg College and worked in the Society's Collections Management Office. A lifelong resident of the Gettysburg area, Andrew is passionate about local and regional history with an emphasis on Civil War era and African American history and culture. He is the author of a book and numerous articles on his research on Civil War era cartography and Gettysburg, and was recently featured in the Washington Post and Hallowed Ground magazine. With that, we will have about a 10-minute presentation from each of our guests, and then we will go into a Q&A with each of the panelists. So please feel free to put your questions, and I will facilitate hopefully a really wonderful conversation. So I would love to get started. Cara, can I hand things off to you to get us to kind of kick us off?
Sure. Let me get my presentation up here. Give me 1 second.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
All right. So starting off here today is, looking in the mirror, and we're going to look in the mirror at the Cumberland County Historical Society and all that means. And this is something that I've been actively working on over the past several years. And probably the most terrifying presentation I've ever given was a variation of this kind of looking in the mirror and looking at ourselves at the Historical Society in our own lecture hall. In some cases to people that have been connected to the Historical Society for decades and not knowing what their response was going to be and kind of going into this like, am I going to get fired after this? But generally, the people at that presentation were thankful, and their response was basically, it's about time that we're having these discussions and owning up to our own history. And I always say, this is my opinion, especially for the setup of the Cumberland County Historical Society, it would be easy and kind of what I think of as passing the buck to call out a few people from our institutional past to blame for some of these things. But I think we need to own it as an institution and apologize for it as an institution across the board and not just put the blame on certain people. So we're founded in 1874. So we're reaching that 150th birthday. So we've had lots of time to make missteps and cause problems for ourselves. And we're founded by the will of James Hamilton Jr. And our community and our institution have always liked to celebrate good things and ignore the giant asterisks sometimes next to something. For example, with James Hamilton, he was a strong proponent of the public school system from its founding in 1836 until his death. And people love to play that up, but ignore the fact that he really wasn't for education for everybody. And so kind of working to make sure we tell the other side of the story, the ignored part of the story, which we have often ignored. He obviously didn't really have anything to do with us other than creating us in his will. We've had a lot of other leadership over the years that have done some amazing things and have done some pretty awful things and allow their biases and prejudice to shade the work that they do. We were founded as a men's only club, subscription library, and women were invited as guests of members, and women were presenting papers even before they were allowed to join. It was never written down that people of color couldn't join, but it didn't have to be. It was known. And so for years, it remained very much an upper class, whites only institution, even though it never had to be written down. And Cumberland County, like so much of South Central Pennsylvania, is predominantly white. And if you look at this, you'll even see that within Cumberland County, our Asian population is a smidge bigger than our African American population, and that is not reflected in our collections at all, and that is a work in progress. How do we connect to the people coming and settling in Cumberland County, the different religious groups, and to build those bridges that we are telling the full history of Cumberland County as it evolves, and that is very much a work in progress, some working better than others. So this is a discussion that's up in the air right now, and how can we build new bridges with the new people that are making Cumberland County their home and realizing their stories are important to our greater history. Another chance for me to call ourselves out. One of my favorite collections is the Johnson collection, and it is a wonderful multi-generational collection that tells the story. It starts with formerly enslaved people from the South who moved into Carlisle. One of the originators of this family, it was a Civil War United States colored troop, and it, their descendants through kind of the mid 20th century, and it has photographs and paper and museum artifacts. In the case of William Andrews here, pictured in his Oddfellows uniform, we have pretty much that entire uniform, and it is a magnificent collection. And our leadership at the time, some of our leadership at the time wanted to turn it down because they did not perceive it as having value. And some of these leadership were academics, and they came into the academic field before the rise of social history and women's studies and the growth of the field of history, and very much into the things that they wrote about and didn't perceive this as having value. Thankfully, other leadership at the time put their foot down and said, no, we absolutely need this collection. And thankfully that is the one that won, because I can't imagine not having this collection. But that attitude, that pervasiveness of not wanting to hear these stories or not thinking they were important was known, that we didn't care. And why would someone come to us with a donation of their family items when it was likely that they were going to get the response that we didn't care? And we built these walls around ourselves. We hurt the community around us, and we need to own that. And people have long memories, and I don't blame them. So that is work that we are working on and we can't undo it, but we can hopefully create a better future that is more inclusive. The one story that is unique to us in Carlisle, and really where I see a shift in storytelling first, because we were actually telling this one. We were ignoring the other stories, but this one was actually being told, is the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. And I say we kind of grew up together, and that the school was founded 5 years after we were, closes in 1918. But our leadership and the school's leadership would have rubbed elbows together. We would have interacted with students for sure. And the institution and the community that surrounds us were very supportive of this quote experiment for decades. We talked about it in a very positive way. And several decades ago, that narrative took a hard turn, and we started telling the much truer story of what happened at the Carlisle Barracks during that almost 40 years that the Carlisle Indian Industrial School existed. And that narrative continues to evolve as there's been an explosion of scholarship. But this is really where this shift in narrative starts, and it's obviously grown to other parts of our community in more recent time. Other ways that we're trying to fix this or working on making sure we're more inclusive. We have a Gardner Digital Library initiative where we have our kind of Wikipedia of Cumberland County history, so we can make sure a lot of these stories are known and accessible freely. We also have a United States Colored Troop project that's very much a work in progress that is on this site as well. And importantly, we kind of have layman oral histories here. And this is also, kind of breaking down barriers, especially with class divisions. We ask someone to be interviewed and we'll hear, I just worked at the factory, my story isn't important, and trying to get across that we care about all these stories. And so many of those worker stories aren't recorded in the business records. You're not getting that day-to-day life of actually working in a factory, as an example. So telling people we value their stories, and we really do, and that there's no other way of recording these stories if they don't share them with us. So that is a work in progress. It took a kind of delay during COVID, but hopefully back up and running. Another story that is very near to my heart, and I've been actively involved with, is Lincoln Cemetery. There are obviously many Lincoln cemeteries, and there are 2 in Cumberland County. This is the one about 3 blocks north of the Historical Society. It's the oldest Black cemetery in Carlisle. It's important because of that. It's also important because of what happened to it. And in the 1970s, it was destroyed and made into a public park. There's one remaining tombstone. And my fear was how many generations until people forget what this space is, because there's not a lot of visual reminders. And everyone, the borough, the descendants, everyone was ready to have a conversation about what happened here. And so the Historical Society, we have a working group. Everything that happens there is led by the descendants. We've had some public art that's happened there, and that was funded by the Humanities Council and the Pennsylvania Council of the Arts. And the borough has issued a resolution of apology. The space was officially rededicated as a cemetery on Memorial Day this year. So the story is growing and evolving, as we speak. So that is an important project that's happening. Another one, and kind of the power of a shared story. It's the last story I'll tell. So Heart and Soul is very much about sharing stories and finding out what's important in communities. And this comes out of the greater Carlisle and a little community called Mount Holly Springs, which today has about 2,000 people living in it. And Pam was gathering stories, and everyone said, you have to talk to the Gundy sisters. You have to talk to them. And so over the course of several meetings and phone calls, Carrie and Enda Gundy were ready to share their story. They had built that rapport and trust. And boy, did they ever share a story. And they shared the story of their grandfather, a man named Elias Parker. And their grandfather was a Civil War veteran and is buried in the segregated cemetery that is near the church. And their grandfather built the church for his wife. He was not a member of the AME Zion Church. He was a Baptist. So he would come into Carlisle for church, but he built this church. And it was so much more than a church. It was this community center for this small African-American population at the base of the mountain in Mount Holly Springs. And they were scared to tell this story because their family home of the Parkers had already been condemned and torn down. And they were worried the same thing would happen to the church. This is a view from their backyard of what the church looked like from their house. And nature had protected it and reclaimed it a little bit, but definitely protected it. This is the view from the front and inside when that story was told. And literally in the 1970s, as the community members left to find better economic opportunities elsewhere, they shut the door one Sunday and it was a time capsule. There were literally hymnals left open in pews. It was amazing that so much still existed in this space. And when they, all the stars aligned, everyone rallied behind the story and wanted to hear and learn and grow the story. The borough of Mount Holly Springs took ownership of the church, which was a process in of itself because it didn't have an owner. The Historical Society was a fiscal sponsor while the Mount Tabor Preservation Project worked on getting their 501c3 together. The communities rallied behind it. The local college has helped. Eagle Scouts, everyone has kind of rallied around this story. And this is where that church is at today. And it's growing. That story hasn't stopped. And just because someone was willing to listen and to earn trust that this story is known. And in the words of my colleague, who has since moved on to different institutions, but has always said, shame on us. Shame on us for not knowing this story. Shame on us for not telling it. So we have to own that, and we have to apologize for it, and it's a work in progress. And the walls that we built aren't going to come down overnight, and that's on us, and that is work we need to continue. And I look forward to continuing this conversation.
Thank you, Cara. Wow, those are really beautiful and powerful pictures. Thank you so much for sharing with all of us. Ms. Nutter, are you ready to show us all the goods that you have for today?
I sure am.
All right, thank you so much.
Here we go. Here we go. Okay, I would like to start by sharing this with everyone. I am not a trained historian nor researcher, but I have a true passion for history, and I have a true passion for telling our story, the Black history story, the American history story of Gettysburg. So that's why I'm here today, and I will come full circle with trying to share with you all why it's so important to share the full American story told in our words. So I will start with that. Okay, as I was introduced, I am the president of the Black History Museum Incorporated Board of Directors here in Gettysburg, and our mission here and our vision is to eventually have a bricks and mortar building that will house the artifacts, the Black history artifacts, and important things that Black folk here in Gettysburg have had. And I have to share this with you at the very beginning. And I will talk more about this as I go along. We have established a wonderful working relationship with Andrew Dalton, who's the executive director of the Adams County Historical Society. And I do have to share this too. What Cara was saying permeates all across, I'm sure, the country with Black folk and historical societies. The story, well, just look at American history. The story of Black folk was never deemed important, so it was never taught. It was never shared. So now we have become, I sound very flip and glib about it, but I don't mean it to sound flip and glib. We have become the flavor of the month. I want us to become the flavor of forever. So that's our mission. And not only telling the African-American story, I think historical societies have the onus to tell all of the American story, good, bad, and indifferent. It's not always pretty, but it's history. It's there and we need to share it. So having said that, that's our reason, is just to share this beautiful, beautiful story. And I would not be doing this if it weren't for these wonderful folks that I work with, the board of directors. And if you see up top there, there's a lady, Mary Alice Nutter. She's my sister. She was the founder about 10 years ago. I will share this story. Our mother, Margaret Thomas Nutter, who has been here, her family has been here, like my family, since the early 1800s. And she knew all of this history. And because she heard it, because remember back then, many Black folk were not able to read or write. So how did the stories get told? They were told and shared when Black folk gathered together. They would tell stories and they would pass it down in the tradition of, oral tradition of African Americans. So, and there's my sister on the right, on the left, Mary Alice Nutter, standing by St. Paul. And that church plays a big, important role in the history of Gettysburg. And on the right is a picture. Every year we hold a little gathering. The Gettysburg Black History Board of Directors, we hold a gathering to share with some important folks who have been supportive of us, of our accomplishments and what we're doing and what we plan to do. So we can go on to the next one then. And now, if you see this picture here on the right, that is my tribe. They are my aunts and uncles. And Cara, I have relatives in Carlisle also, very important, that played very important roles over there. As you would know, South Central Pennsylvania, Black folk, they knew each other. Because, well, it was survival. But anyway, a lot of the stories that I learned from them. And I have to share this with you and all of you researchers out there. you cannot discount the oral histories, because every story that was shared with me by every one of them sitting there, I have researched, and stories have been proven to be true and accurate, which just is amazing to me. It's just amazing to me. I mean, down to the roads and to the directions to the places, those stories, and I'm not the only one. So you have a whole scope of Black folk that these stories have been told to, that have just been never even listened to or accounted for as important. So that's our history with that. And this table, that table that Mary Alice is sitting at, is the table that my mother sat at with her and gave her the edict, okay, Mary Alice. There's very important Black history here in Gettysburg that needs to be told. It's American history, and it needs to be shared, and it's very important, because if it wouldn't be for Black folk, there wouldn't be a Gettysburg, because we're an integral part of this town. So that was the genesis, and we still have that table. It was built in 1863. Now, this continues to talk a little bit more about the history. The picture in the upper left hand there is a group of children, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, who one year had their own Memorial Day parade, little kids, because at one time in Gettysburg, they would not allow Black folk to march in the Memorial Day parades. And it's so interesting to me, because the armed services, lots of Black men from this town, I mean, most of them served in the armed forces, but they could not walk in the parade to honor our veterans. So they had their own, and they had their own services at our Black Lincoln Cemetery. And the bottom picture is a picture of children that went to St. Paul AME Zion Church, and I'll talk more about that. AME Zion Church was like the hub of everything that happened: social justice activities, social activities, all those kinds of things. We'll go on to the next one. And again, those are more pictures of Black folk. It was very intriguing to me. Growing up here, you would have never known there was a thriving Black community. I mean, very, very thriving, had business people. They had their own social clubs and things like that, because of course at that time back, I guess not until the 60s, early 60s, were things integrated. So in what was called then the Third Ward area, Black folk lived. That was the only place that they could buy. They couldn't buy homes in any other part of Gettysburg, but they could buy homes there. And that was the hub of the social activity and their lives. And there are more pictures here. And I like to talk about the folks in the pictures, the stories of the folks in the pictures. If you see down on the bottom left picture, that is a young, well, she graduated from high school, which was very unusual for that time in the 20s. And then the other gentleman, the two gentlemen on the left side, they also lived in Gettysburg and were a very integral part of the happenings here. And Miss Katie, the older woman, I knew her growing up, which flabbergasts me sometimes how close I still am to the history. And she is a relative of Magpum, who was captured by, or tried to get captured by slaveholders, and she fought them off, and there's wonderful stories surrounding that whole thing. So it's very interesting. I'm very close to the history because I'm the great-granddaughter of Lloyd Watts, Lloyd F.A. Watts, who was a sergeant in the USCT troops. We'll go on to the next one. Next one. Uh-oh. There we go. Okay, we'll go on to the next one. Well, okay, the community, as I shared, this picture here is how Gettysburg was laid out, and the Black folk in the light blue part, that is what is called the Third Ward, and that's where Black folk lived. And immigrants moved there. I grew up in that neighborhood, and it's very interesting. It wasn't until the early 1970s that I knew of Black folk ever being able to buy any property outside of that area. And it's interesting, before that, in the early 1800s, there were Black folk that owned farms on the battlefield. But in that area, that Third Ward area, that was the concentration of the life of Black folk in Gettysburg, because they were not allowed downtown after dark, and they were not allowed to participate in their social clubs and all that. So their lives, they made their lives there in the Third Ward. We'll move on. And now we'll talk about the churches. This is St. Paul AME Zion Church. This is a church that I grew up in. This church, they were very much into social activism, the Sons of Goodwill, the Slave Refugee Society, Daniel Payne, who was one of the founders of the AME Church, a Black minister. He graduated from the United Lutheran Seminary. And while he was here in the 1800s, he started a school, taught Black folk and to read and write. And he would attend this church. And in that church, there is a window that he paid for, and it's dedicated to him. And we'll go to the next slide. And these, we'll go back one, please go back one. Can you go back there? Now I put these in here because it's important to note. There were two other churches, Black churches in Gettysburg. And one was the Asbury Methodist Church, and the other was the St. John's Primitive Baptist Church. And in reading these articles, you could see, again, these were stories that I heard growing up, that a lot of the social activity and the social justice activity was amazing to me. A health fair was held for Black folk from the church. They did, I found one article that I didn't put in here. They were at the Asbury Methodist Church, and I heard this story growing up, and I researched it, and it was true. They were having a Bible study meeting one Wednesday night.
Oh, okay. I think we may have.
They didn't hurt him. Oh, they didn't hurt him. They kept him there until the police came and they took him out. So, and I heard that story growing up, but there's more to it than that. But I researched it and I found out that that's so. So we'll go on to the next one. Now this education, the picture in the middle is of the colored school. Of course, the schools were segregated back then. And there's a picture on the left with some of the children. And I put the picture on the right in there because that tree, there was a story behind that tree. My great-grandfather, Lloyd Watts, planted that tree. But education was very, very important. And Lloyd Watts was also a teacher here in Gettysburg. We can move that along to the next one. Now, the economic impact, I included this because, as I said, that Third Ward area, it was condensed and everything had to kind of happen there. So the picture on the left was Mr. Lyles. He was also a minister, Reverend Lyles. It was a log house. It's still standing and it's covered now with siding, but he had a store. And then on the right side in the 50s, but that was a Black-owned restaurant for years in the Third Ward, and it was called the Bronze Inn, because Black folk couldn't go to the restaurants. And the picture right beside it is what it looks like today. And then in the middle shows that there was a garage owned by a Black man here in Gettysburg, and that was in the late 50s. Now, I do have to say this is very important, kind of what Cara said. A lot of the Black important historical buildings here in Gettysburg were torn down because they were not deemed important. So many of the buildings are not there anymore. So we'll go on to the next one, which is a big problem in my estimation. Social justice and military service. As I said, the history here in Gettysburg goes back to the USCT. Lots of Black men joined the colored troops, lots. And then from then on, the history went on, there wasn't any war that Black men here in Gettysburg didn't fight in. And actually some women, Black women joined in World War II. And with the social justice, as I shared, you know, there are many stories about the integration of schools, about housing here in Adams County, in Gettysburg, about jobs here in Gettysburg, lots of social justice things. And many of those activities started and meetings were held at the churches. That's where everything, the genesis of everything.
I'm going to see if she comes back. Thank you all for your patience as see if.
Oh, is it freezing?
No,
Okay.
you are freezing, but you seem to be back now. Can you hear us okay?
Yes.
Lovely,
Okay.
lovely. Thank you.
Okay, you can go to the next one, Andrew. Okay, this is another picture. It gives you an idea of the folks that served here, the Black men and women that served in World War II. Lovely stories. I mean, good stories that I heard over the years from these folks. We can go to the next one. This is my favorite picture. This picture was taken circa 1929, and this goes to show that there was a very cohesive Black community here in Gettysburg. This picture is taken in front of what was then called the Elks building, the Black Elks, because they could not join the White Elks. And annually they had a Christmas party, and the Black Elks for the Black community. And they would gather there, they would have a big dinner, they would sing, they would dance, they would socialize. And in this picture, it's wonderful. My mother is in this picture. She's about 4 years old. You can't see her. She's the one with the little pinafore in the back. And the very tall gentleman on the right is my grandfather. And the woman in the front row with the gray hair, her name is Keziah Cuff. I always loved her name. There are wonderful stories about her. And so this is a picture of one of the main streets in the Third Ward where Black folk lived and socialized, and that building is still there. We can go on to the next one. Now this, in the last picture, you saw people with instruments. They had a group called the Syncopated Five. This was a very important musical group. I heard lots of stories about these folks because my uncles, I had 3 uncles in this group. So I heard lots of wonderful stories about the folks in there. And the gentleman with the megaphone, his name was Mr. Skinny Johnson. I always remembered that because I loved his name, Mr. Skinny Johnson. Okay, we can go on to the next one. And okay, this trombone we have, and this was a part of the Syncopated Five. We can go on, Andrew, to the next ones. These are some of the artifacts that we have, family Bibles. And these pictures I would like to share with you. The woman in the middle, she is the daughter of John Watts, and he was also in the USCT. And her name was Frances Watts, and her mother was a Devan of Gettysburg. And the picture on the right, I included that because I don't know their names, but it's important to note if people had a way to Harrisburg back then, they had a Black club, or as they called it, the Colored Club, the Savoy. And that was a big to-do to get dressed up and go over to the Savoy in Harrisburg. So that I included. And the picture on the left is a woman standing in the doorway of a home on Washington Street. And I can remember hearing stories of how Washington Street looked with the laid brick pavements. We can go on to the next one. I'm sure I'm running. And this picture is of Mr. Penn. I heard a lot about him because he was a family friend. He was the first Black licensed battlefield guide. You never heard anything about this. And there he is with a group of people that he was giving a tour to over the battlefield. And that was his card that he gave to my mother that was kept in her trunk. We can go on to the next one. Now, this is Magpum that I was talking about. This chair was recently donated to the Adams County Historical Society because it was in her family. Magpum this goes to show how close and tight-knit our communities were. She was the great-grandmother of my godmother. And very wonderful stories about this woman. You know, I heard always, you know, the women that I heard of growing up, she loved to have fun, but she did not play. So we can move on to the next one. Now, this is a picture of young Black folk when they were playing, just pictures of them gathering, because they, as you notice, there are no white children in that picture. They even go on a playground, they had to go, you can see the status of the merry-go-round that they're on. That was for Black children. The next one. And this was the picture that I was telling you about. If you go to the next one, Andrew, please. This is as they said, the colored Memorial Day parade. And I can remember vividly these parades because we would have to get dressed up as kids. We would go to Lincoln Cemetery. They would have a program. And I remember that too, because my sister was always, the oldest sister was always asked to recite the Gettysburg Address. But now being older and thinking back to that, you know, it just gives me pause that it had to be separate. And it was always a big to-do in the Black community, the 30th of May parade for Black folk. Okay, we can go on to the next one. Now, these are just a compilation of pictures of around the town. We can go on, Andrew. Now, this is a picture. There were a few people, 2 or 3 people that I heard of oral history that had cars. And if they had a car, what they did Sunday is they would go in the cars and they would drive around the battlefield. That was their social event. They could go on the battlefield without any problem. So we can move on from that. We can go to the next one. Next one. Uh-oh. Are we frozen? Oh, okay. Well, this picture, the picture that was right before that was his name. We called him Papa Reed. And the next one, Andrew, can you go to the next one? The lady on the right is his wife, and we called her Mama Reed with one of her grandchildren. Now, I put this in because you see the generations of the women on the left. Mama Reed is in there, and these, you'll see the house that they lived in. The woman on the picture on the left, all the way on the end, was the wife of the gentleman. Her name was Jessie Van. Her husband, Mr. Van, owned the Pittsburgh Courier newspaper, the only Black newspaper back then. And I can remember vividly when she would come to Gettysburg, because their house was across the street from mine where I grew up, and she would come in a chauffeur-driven limousine, and that was a big to-do, and you would never know. I mean, she was sisters with Mama Reed, and she bought the home there for their family there. And that's all of them, the Wansel family and the Penn family there. We can move on. Now, these also show pictures of when they were young. It's the same couple when they were older and then when they were younger. Richard Thomas is the namesake of Richard Henry Thomas, my grandfather. Okay, we can move it on. Okay, now I just want to show you pictures of what it looked like in the Third Ward. Okay, that is a picture on the right of Washington Street. And then on the left, there's a picture with a carriage of where Meade School was, and that was the first school that was integrated. And there are wonderful stories of integration that my grandfather was a part of. This picture right here is a picture of Ag Hall that was torn down. Frederick Douglass spoke there. Again, back to the story again, most of the Black historical places have been torn down in Gettysburg. The next one, Andrew, and this home was a home of the Matthews family. The Matthews family was related to the Biggs family. The reason why that name is important, Basil Biggs was a man that you'll hear a lot about in Gettysburg history. What you hear about is that he helped to bury the dead after the Civil War, the Union soldiers after the Civil War. And that house still stands. This is the home that I was talking about that was across the street from my home, where Jessie Van bought for her family. Again, it was torn down, a beautiful Victorian home. This in the third ward, this was a store where Black folk could go shop. And the people that owned that, the brothers that owned that, they were a part of the Black community. And this was in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. They were wonderful. Next one. And this also was a home where the Johnson family lived, Black family in Gettysburg. And this home is a home that was owned by a gentleman, Hopkins, who was a janitor at Gettysburg College, but also very important part of the Slave Refugee Society at the St. Paul AME Zion Church. And that house still stands. In fact, they're trying to decipher what to do with that home. Okay, we can move on. Next one. This was, there's the bronze in. The picture before was a pool hall. There it is. That was a pool hall. And we can go on, keep going on. These are just slides of, this home was the home of Lloyd Watts, my great-grandfather. And my mother was born in this home. And my aunts and uncles, most of them were born in this home. And it still stands. And this is the log cabin that I showed you. There it is. It's still standing across the street from the church. It's just covered with siding, and a family lives there now. Okay, and the bottom line is I would like to share with you that we want to preserve and educate and inspire. And all of you folk out there, it's not an easy road to try to build relationships with Black folk, to try to get the stories told, because for so many years, the stories were discounted, and still in the oral tradition, they're being discounted. So there has to be a way that trust is built. And I have to say honestly that Andrew and I have been working very carefully and closely together to try to forge and build that relationship. And we're still having issues to this very day, still having issues, but we will work through them, because in the end, the product will be a wonderful way of telling the whole American story in our words, not appropriated, but in our words. Thank you for letting me share our story.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I can't think of a better way to hand the mic to Andrew. I think you've really kind of teed things up. Without further ado, Andrew, let's pass it to you.
Thank you, Jane. And I just want to say Jane is really an inspiration to our whole community here, because, you know, having collected all these incredible resources with her entire family's help over the past, several decades, it's just an unparalleled resource. And as Cara mentioned earlier, that's something that the Historical Society had not done in the past. We really don't have many collections from the Black community in Adams County. And so having this collection that's still intact, that is in the holdings of the Black History Museum, and Jane and her family, it's just unbelievable that it's, exactly the right time, I think, to put all of this together and really tell the story of Adams County like it hasn't been told before. So without further ado, I'll just get into a few points I just wanted to touch upon. So the Black community of Adams County is not very large, just like we saw in Cumberland County. It fluctuated quite a bit over the 19th century into the 1920s and 30s, and between 200 and 800, 700 or 800 at its peak before the Civil War. So not a large population, probably like Cumberland County, maybe 3 or 4% of the total population of the county. And as Jane already touched upon, the third ward of Gettysburg is where the Black community was able to purchase real estate and live. And this is still the case today. The Black community really is still centered in the third ward, where the St. Paul's AME Church is located. And as we know, Jane could speak to this more, but redlining and discrimination of real estate practices continued into the 1950s, 60s, probably into the 70s. I'm sure Jane could speak to that. And so the community is still centered in the third ward of Gettysburg. But, and Jane alluded to this as well, there were many Black farm owners on the Gettysburg battlefield at the time of the Civil War. And that's kind of a fact that's becoming more and more appreciated. The National Park Service has really started to interpret these sites more. They just restored the Warfield Farm on the Second Day's battlefield, and now they have waysides and other interpretive markers. But really, there were 6 or 7, depending on how you count, Black farms, Black-owned properties on the Gettysburg battlefield when the battle erupted in July of 1863. And with the exception of the Warfield property, they were all torn down. The Bryan House was rebuilt. But as it's just such a great point that Jane made, that there's so few of these structures that are associated with Black history that are still around today. And I did want to touch on just briefly Magpum's story. This is something that Jane brought up, and we're so fortunate to actually have the chair that Magpum used, her rocking chair, in our collection now that we'll be putting into our new museum. But this is a photograph of Magpum taken in the mid to late 1800s, but she's actually showing how her hands were tied during a kidnapping attempt in 1858. And it's just a phenomenal photograph and really speaks to the courage of the Black community in our area that's only miles from the Mason-Dixon line, just 8 miles away. And so there are frequent incidents where slave catchers come into Pennsylvania and just round people up, throw them into the back of a wagon, and take them south. And Magpum was able to fight them off and actually brought them to court. They were tried and prosecuted, and they were locals who were actually assisting slave catchers from below the Mason-Dixon line. So a very difficult place to live at the, in the lead up to the Civil War and during the Civil War. There's also a flood of refugees through this area before the Battle of Gettysburg, when the Union Army moves into Pennsylvania and the Confederates are pursuing them. And so, to get ahead of this Confederate advance, there was a caravan of escaped slaves, of free people moving north toward Harrisburg through this area. So just really fascinating Civil War period history that we have. This is the chair again. I didn't realize Jane had it, but I just wanted to highlight how excited we are to have this included. We're building a new museum, and we really want to celebrate the stories of Black citizens like Magpum. Then one other story that Jane also mentioned, Jack Hopkins, who was the janitor of Gettysburg College at the time of the Civil War. We actually have discovered in our collection and at the college's collection some photographs of his house. It was owned by the college, but he lived there from about 1860 until his death in 1868. And we have a picture of Jack Hopkins here from the Gettysburg College collection. There's also one in a private collection here. But we've done a little bit of modeling to figure out where this house would have stood. And actually, there's currently an archaeological dig in progress done by Gettysburg College in collaboration with the Historical Society and the Black History Museum to excavate the site of this home so that we can learn more details about the lives of the Hopkins family. So this was taken just a couple of days ago, and we're thrilled that there's this partnership happening right now that'll lead to some new information about this family. And this is the Lincoln Cemetery. As we talked about earlier, there are many, many Lincoln cemeteries around the country. But here in Gettysburg, we've really tried to shine a light on the story of this cemetery. It still exists, and it's in the 3rd Ward, in Gettysburg's 3rd Ward. And in collaboration with the Black History Museum and the college, again, we've kind of done a lot of things together, the 3 organizations. We put together a database showing all of the information about every burial in the cemetery, and starting in 1832 through to the present. We looked at death certificates, obituaries, estate files from the Historical Society collection, all kinds of other miscellaneous records, and some photographs from the Black History Museum to try to piece together the stories of the hundreds of people buried here. And kind of stunning is that of the 450 or so burials there, only 219 are marked graves that exist today. So less than half of, or roughly half of the burials there are not marked. And we've discovered them through obituaries, through oral history, through death certificates made available on Ancestry.com via the state archives. And so it's been a really wonderful, rewarding project. There's a link to that on the Adams County Historical Society website if you're interested. Then I thought I'd just end with a rendering of, we're actually building a new museum for the Adams County Historical Society, a brand new facility. It's under construction right now, and it'll be just north of town. And we're really excited to, when we're in this museum, to highlight the entire story of the Black community from start to finish, not just isolating it into one section, which had been done in prior museums and in our own work in the past, in past museums and exhibits. So we're really excited about working with Jane and with others in the community that have photographs and stories and artifacts that will be able to weave through the story of Gettysburg and Adams County. And we have a special partnership that we've developed called for a special exhibit gallery we're doing called Black Voices of Adams County that will highlight through time various citizens and what they've done to make a real impact on our community. So there's a lot going on in Gettysburg, and none of it would be possible without the wonderful work that Jane and her organization have done to make sure this history is still protected in the absence of our own work to do so. And as everyone said so far, it's just so important that we find ways to work together and listen and understand and I think over time we can continue to build on the work that we've done and really create something that will include all of Adams County. So thank you for your time, and thank you, Jane, for setting that up and your kind words.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you for showing our slides today, and just a hats off for helping with Ms. Nutter's slides. We really appreciate it.
Yes. No problem.
At this point, I know that I have like 8,000 questions. You should see my notes here. I'm just thrilled with everything that you have shared with us. And I have a few things that I would love to dive into. But before I do, I would like to encourage and challenge our audience here today to kind of get those questions typing in the bottom of your Zoom screen. You should see a Q&A feature there. You can put your questions for any of the panelists, or if you have a question that might be applicable to multiple panelists, that's fine. Please put it in the Q&A, and I will moderate them kind of as I see them. So there's that. But before as we kind of wait for a few questions to come in, I just have to say, Ms. Nutter, when are you going to do a walking tour of Gettysburg? Because I will be the first person to sign up. I think I was in awe of everything that you had to share, and the photographs, both the photographic and the memorabilia that kind of illustrate the story. And I think just a walking tour of your knowledge. So I gotta ask, have you ever thought about not just the physical museum, but something more out in Gettysburg?
We certainly have, Dominique. We certainly have. In fact, we work with Gettysburg College with their IT department, and we've almost completed it. COVID, the pandemic, really put the clinch to everything. It was almost ready to roll out, and then just the pandemic hit, and then we had to just stop everything. So it's almost ready to roll out, and that was the very first thing that we started to work on, because I became president, I guess, 4 years ago. And that was one of the things that I wanted to do, because as I said, a lot of the sites are gone. So we need to have something that's going to be here to document where these sites were and what happened at these sites. So I will definitely let you know. You will be the first one. In fact, we might bring you along on the tryout.
I'm already signed up.
Okay, sounds good.
I'm already signed up. And actually, speaking of the physical places, I would love to kind of direct our first question from the audience to you. But due to some technical difficulties, you kind of went in and out there for just a very split second. And the audience is kind of wondering, they missed a part about what happened at Asbury Church on Wednesdays. And they were wondering if you could just repeat that very quickly.
Sure. There was, this story was told to me, and I'm not telling all of it, but I will just tell you the parts. There was, Asbury Methodist Church was actually the oldest Black church, Asbury AME. And they were having a Bible group on Wednesday night. And they, white salesman came into their Bible study group. And he was, it wasn't told to me this way, but he was inebriated and started to cause a ruckus. Well, the gentlemen that were there that evening didn't harm him. they got him calmed down and they called the police and they kept him there until the police came, and they just let him, the police took him and just let him sober up and then go on, and nothing happened after that. So, but there's a very colorful story that was told to me. that's the PG version.
I understand. And, actually kind of on that thought, one of the questions that I have for each of the panelists, and so please feel free to answer as you will, but I'm wondering if each of you can speak to your idea of the archivist's role or our repository's role in what is the concept of the truth? I know each of you have kind of touched on the history or narrative or oral histories or truth or not truth or founding. What is our role in truth telling? What is that? If it's a concept, are we aiding the truth? Are there multiple truths? Is there more truths? I'm not sure. I'd love your thoughts on that.
In my opinion, before we even get to that question, you have to have all the versions of truths out there. Mm-hmm. And right now, all those versions are not there. Mm-hmm. And if they're there, they have been appropriated and told by folks that, and I have to say this, just look at the panelists here. I mean, how diverse is it? And I'm sure the audience, the archivists that are out there, how diverse is that group? Mm-hmm. So I think all of the stories have to be out there, not just Black, but Native American, Hispanic, mm-hmm. Asian, they all.
Engaging with the collection to know what you have and what you don't have, and building from there. There has to be kind of an honest assessment of the collection, and you can't tell the story sometimes. You can't, or I should say, highlight the story with the documents like we like to do when they don't exist within the collection, mm-hmm. and that is building bridges and seeking guidance from descendants mm-hmm. of like Lincoln Cemetery and working with them and for these projects to make sure those voices, like Ms. Nutter so eloquently puts that, those voices need to lead some of the things that happen and making sure their voices are heard in what we're doing.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would just say that I think it's important to remember that as much as you might have a personal relationship and like Jane and I have, that I still represent an institution, and that institution has a very long history. Mm-hmm. And I think through our wonderful relationship that we've developed, I think I've become more aware of the fact that we have this relationship, but I'm still carrying to an extent the history of the Adams County Historical Society when I enter, a meeting with people. Mm-hmm. And it's, and I don't say that to suggest that we should just be, falling over ourselves to apologize for the past. But I do think you have to, these things take time. And Jane has really helped me understand, how you can be successful in this, because she's been fighting some of these battles for a lot longer than anybody else I know. So I think just recognizing and having the patience to really work hard on these relationships. And that's how you change the institutional view that others have, from who've maybe had bad interactions with your institution.
Absolutely. And I think that is a reality that many of us face across the state. I think that's something that is not unique. I think that there's parts of that we can all kind of take from. And it makes me wonder if there have been any examples that you might point to in the Adams County or Cumberland County areas that have done it well, where you've seen very positive examples of collaborating with the descendants or collaborating with families. And I know we've talked a lot about the Lincoln Cemetery, but are there any other examples maybe within your repositories in which you've seen collaborative metadata work, or you've seen examples of public programming that was inclusive of descendants? Could you speak to anything like that?
Well, I certainly, I think it all really is based on relationships. And as Andrew said, he and we have forged this relationship, and it's still, I mean, it's an ongoing process. It's a work in progress. And he has been to our board meeting, to one of our board meetings. We have talked about, what we want to do together. And it really all boils down, in my view, in my opinion, to relationships. There has to be a trust that's built. And we have planned on doing things together and recognizing each other publicly, that too, because then again, with this whole thing, that gives the message credibility. Isn't it just ironic that even is even into play now? But giving credibility to the story, that I publicly and privately support him as he does with me, and folk know that. And it all goes back to relationship and building that relationship. I know it sounds maybe like hokey, but it really is that bottom line. It's the relationship. And coming in, to this whole deal together with Andrew, and I'm sure this goes across the whole state, the whole country, with Black folk and historical societies, because for so long, the stories have been discounted. Now, and as Andrew said, we don't need people falling over themselves, apologizing, and all of that kind of stuff. It's the work is in your action. Walk your talk. Mm-hmm. If you walk your talk, people are going to trust you. So that's where it starts, with the relationship. Again, that's my opinion.
For sure. With us, and I can see the Mount Tabor Preservation Project is a great example, which I already talked about. But typically, there's been a lot of programs. People want to hear that story, and that's typically or has been a two-person presentation, and one of the descendants who's currently the president of the Mount Tabor Preservation Project is definitely present. And then sometimes I speak with her, or someone else speaks with her. And then we give each other help with different things. And the Preservation Project doesn't have coming from the archives background. So we can talk to them about a deed of gift, and we can give them some pointers and help them out along the way from the professional side. And then they, it's mutual sharing of information, and we can help each other in so many different ways. But it's definitely definitely a joint venture that has, sprung forth in their own 501c3, but it's still very much connected. And their altar chairs are on exhibit in our museum after they were redone. So it's definitely, we can help them in certain ways with some of the knowledge we have, because this is our field, and then they can make sure they're leading the story and how that story is told. There's multiple descendants involved with the church, and they definitely lead what's happening there.
Love that. Andrew, did you want to chime in any bit?
The first thing that came to mind, not totally related, but I think actually Gettysburg College does a very good job engaging the Hispanic community in Adams County. We have a significant migrant population, but also a lot of permanent Hispanic, community members who have been here for their whole lives. And the college, I think I look to them as an example of, ways to really engage the community and have a collaborative relationship, not just a relationship that's good for PR, which I think is sometimes something we see, and that is very frustrating, I would imagine, for everybody. So yeah, I think that's just one thing that came to mind. I don't have a better example.
Absolutely. But I wonder if I could ask you maybe, or to all of you, if you could expand upon that. I think my question is really to something that Ms. Nutter said is, sometimes these stories become flavor of the month versus flavor of forever. And I think that kind of goes to what you're saying about PR. And so my question is, as an archivist and with the institutions, with our repositories, with whatever we're working with, budgets and buildings, how can we systematically create structures around what we're doing now so that it is not flavor of the month? What can we do? What practical things can we give an audience that they might be able to incorporate in their own institutions that are structural changes?
Just from a practical point, I was just sitting here thinking and this goes back to my teaching early childhood education days. The story has to be recognized as important. Even if I'm collecting materials, then if I say, okay, I found this, it is important. Your story is important to me. It's important to me. So I'm going to include your story here. It reminds me of a Maya Angelou saying it. She said, people may forget what you say or what you do, but they never forget how they make you feel. So that's kind of what it is. It has to, you can talk all of the archivist stuff you want, but the bottom line is that the story has to be, the person or the people or the whatever has to be made to feel that their story is important and that it's told in a way, in their words, no matter what. And that's the starting point. No matter what you do, that's the starting point. So there has to be some point of contact with somebody that says, okay, yes, we're going to bring these stories in because yes, they are important. When it's recognized that the stories are there, then, I'm thinking back as a kid, my goodness, if I would have known that my great-grandfather's family owned a farm on the battlefield whose property now is part of the Eisenhower farm, imagine what that does to a kid's self-image, and all of that. But I was blessed to have a family that shared these stories with me. So I knew about it. But how many other kids, white, black, whatever, it's important for all kids, all colors, to know the whole story. So it has to start there. I'll be quiet now. I'm a talker. I'll be quiet.
No, I appreciate that. But I wanted to give Cara or Andrew, do you have any thoughts on how we can incorporate systematic, or structural changes in our work so that these conversations are not of the moment?
For sure. And I think some of that's just institutional change and, looking at structures and how many, the staff at the Historical Society is white. And, to raise up young professionals to get them into the field. And then you have museum and historical society leaders that, these are their stories, or making sure our board isn't all right like it had been for a century. That, those structural changes to make sure those voices are present at different levels is a work in progress. And making sure those, it's the stories in the collection, but also institutional changes and making sure that the opportunities are given to, young professionals and then that they can move up to run and making sure those opportunities are there. I'd love to see that the field evolve, that there's more voices present in the field, for sure. And that's definitely a structural change. So to see that happen as well. I don't know how well I said that, but I know what I'm trying to say.
No, and I think you're actually getting to a point that one of our guests put into the chat of saying the exact same thing, and that kind of what you were saying was addressed this recently, a couple of weeks ago in Gettysburg at the local Merit conference about, how can previously or marginalized silenced voices be uplifted through our collections work. And some of the key takeaways during that discussion were to, as you had mentioned, but to kind of uplift the comment here, is to recruit, retain, and attract more BIPOC historians and scholars into the into the archival and public heritage profession. So I just wanted to uplift that because it was perfect timing to the comment in the chat or in the Q&A. Andrew, did you have any thoughts on structural work here?
I just think Jane kind of hit the nail on the head for me. I think it's all about early education. We have the opportunity to interact with young people in our communities. And, as the County Historical Society, it's our job to make sure that they find inspiration from the stories that we're telling. And if we're not telling any stories about people who look like them and people who might be their own ancestors, then we're missing a huge opportunity, I think, to create a sense of pride and a sense of appreciation for for all the things that our ancestors have done to get us to where we are today. So I just think I totally agree with Jane on that. That's what we're trying to do here. Is we've got not just our local kids in Gettysburg, we have millions of students from around the country coming here. So what a wonderful chance we have to work together to make sure that there's more representation of what they're seeing when they come.
You know, I agree, and it makes me think, if you could speak kind of from your own work as a part of the work with Jane, or maybe from other work that you've done at the Historical Society, you know, it kind of brings me to these questions of families, right? You're making me think about families and generations and lineages, and this amazing story that Jane, that you have with your family. I mean, it's just truly incredible. But what is can you talk to the importance of family for kind of archival and historical societies? How do we think about community or self-preservation? How do we think about maybe training families to do their own historical work? Or is there any thoughts within how can historical societies partner with families in real time from day one? You know, can you talk to that?
Yeah, well, I think for us, obviously, genealogy is such a big thing, and I'm sure it is at Cumberland County, and you know, it's very rare that we have Black families come in to do research. Right now, we've been closed since before COVID because of our new building and our move, but it was always just very rare to see people in the Black community or visitors to come in and research their family history. And obviously that's not because they're not interested. It's just because, you know, we haven't been welcoming to that community in the past. And so I think just having an opportunity and a welcoming atmosphere for people to come in and make these discoveries is so important. And I think the key to that is working with Jane and others. We can't do it by ourselves. There's just no way. So you know, we have to work together because it's so important. You know, if we don't work together, there's no way to accomplish these goals. And we have kind of the staff and the infrastructure to make it happen in terms of that genealogy and family history. But the last thing I'll say is just, I'm sure you do too, but we all know people who don't like history very much, but they love their own family history. They're fascinated by genealogy, even if they don't know it yet. You start to put them in front of Ancestry.com, or you type something in and they see their family name. Everybody responds to that. And so I see genealogy as a great tool to engage students of all backgrounds, and not just Adams County, but people who come from all over the country. Why don't we use genealogy to connect them with these stories? And that's such a great way to teach people about the progress that's been made and the progress that has yet to be made, because everybody has ancestors that participated, like Jane, in all of these events. And so if you're researching the Civil War and you have like Jane does, a relative in the United States colored troops, imagine the interest in history that could spark in a child, knowing that they had that connection. So I just think, again, I'll just have to agree with Jane again.
We all do. I think, you know, we usually just spend an hour and a half agreeing with everyone. And, you know, it actually, in speaking of, what I think you're speaking to, Andrew, is this idea of, you know, what Ms. Nutter said earlier. People may forget what you said, but they don't forget how you made them feel. And as we include students, as you said, around the country, not just in Pennsylvania, not just in Adams County, in stories of their own family, they do light up when they see photographs of their great-great-grandfather. Even if they absolutely hated history class, they light up at these stories of their own connections because you've made it real and you've made them feel. And that's really where I personally have always found archives to be such a powerful, powerful tool. And I'm so glad that we are here. And I'm hoping that I can get one, maybe two more questions, because I'm wondering, what might you think is the role or the opportunity, maybe it's an opportunity, that historical societies or local community archives, or maybe even larger resource-rich repositories, but what is the role that archives and community archives can play in policy change as it's happening, and decision-making in our communities as it's happening? And so what I'm thinking of, why this question comes up, is because I'm thinking of the Lincoln Cemetery that gets covered for a playground. And when I think about it, and I'm not a politician or anywhere near these circles, but I think that there are plans and drawings and sketchings and permits and approvals, and there's a lot of things that go into these before they happen. And how can we as archivists assert a more active role in the day-to-day, the contemporary life of our communities, not just the historical life of our communities? Basically, how do we get a seat at the table? Okay. Maybe that's the $1 million question. I imagine, and I'll talk as you guys think, because I'm definitely going to get you to answer. And I wonder, how do we create a profession or profess a profession in which we are consulted or considered or included as decision is being made? How do we become an active part of the table? It's just something that I think is really important because we have so much love to give.
Yeah, and I think about it with this, my answer to this comes from preservation, and you always see people upset when a building's about to be torn down. And how can we get to being proactive rather than reactive? When the bulldozers are already there, it's a losing battle. But how do we get to the point that we make everyone aware of the importance of these sites or these stories, and that it doesn't come down to that because people know better than to say, oh, we're gonna take all these tombstones out and put a green space, because the activism's already there, the knowledge is already there. So how do we get to the point of being reactive to things happening, to being proactive that those things would never happen?
Yeah. Andrew, do you have any thoughts here?
I agree. No, I just completely agree. I think it's just it's a process. It's horrifying to think about a cemetery, like you mentioned, being completely destroyed, and political leaders allowing that to happen. Luckily we haven't had that happening with our Lincoln Cemetery in Gettysburg, but there was a black cemetery earlier on York Street in Gettysburg, and it was completely, it was vacated, but then turned into just a residential area. And so there are undoubtedly many bodies still at that site. And so I would love to see, like you said, Cara, more proactivity about preserving these sites, not just wishing that something had not happened after the fact.
Ms. Nutter, did you have anything? Yes.
Yes, I'd like to add a layman's point of view to this, or layperson's point of view, is if these sites are not going to be preserved or even deemed important unless they're be made known that they are important. Mm-hmm. So to me, it's incumbent upon the historical societies or whatever to share that these places exist, and are an integral part of the community. So what does that mean in brass tacks, where the rubber hits the road? Going to council meetings, community council meetings, borough council meetings, town council meetings, talking to legislators, talking to local politicians, letting them know, okay, this is what happened here, this is what happened here, but yes, it looks run down now, and they want to tear it down, but it cannot be torn down. When I think of all the wonderful places here in Gettysburg that were torn down, it just breaks my heart. I was not of an age to do anything about it, but now I am. So with what's remaining, they're not going to tear down. They are not. So, but how do I do that? I let people know, the people that are in power, let them know what is here. Now that's a layperson's view.
Thank you. I completely agree. We have time for one last question before I turn it over to our gracious hosts and say some final thank yous and goodbyes. But I think the final question that I'd love to kind of give to each of you is if you could go around in 1 or 2 sentences, could you speak to, and this is a question from our audience, could you speak to what it means. What are the action steps? What are the first steps to recruiting recruiting younger professionals in the archival science careers from underrepresented communities? What are those practical first steps? And then we'll close out. And I'll start with you, Andrew.
Yeah, I mean, I would say we have a wonderful relationship with Gettysburg College here, and they do, I feel, a very good job of creating a atmosphere that allows anybody to enter, their various internship programs. So I think I would say, though, beyond that is we have to look to further than just, the places that we're used to working with. There are colleges all around this area that have programs, and we're such a small staff now, we don't really have the capacity to have a big intern program. But when we begin to really look, not just for internships, but for hiring, I think we just need to look outside our box a little bit more and stop thinking about just the usual places where we have people that are funneled to us through.
I love that. Cara, do you have 1 or 2 sentences for us?
Sure. We're very lucky as well. There's several colleges nearby, and Shippensburg University has a applied history program, so we get a fair number of interns through that program. I think also history field in itself reinventing itself, because you can't work, what are you doing with a history major type of conversation that happens, that's a waste of your money, do something else. But there's so much to offer, whether you work in the field or not, and connecting to those stories. But reaching the students even in grade school, that they're connecting and giving them that sense of place, that they care about their community that they live in, that maybe as they grow, that their love of history grows and they want to connect and save it, whether that's in paper form or 3-dimensional artifacts, or advocate for history and another aspect of the field. So reaching them when they're young and then keeping them as they grow older, and maybe have them enter the field and then support them when they do.
I love that too. Ms. Nutter, do you have final thoughts on this topic before we close?
Ditto to both of them. And just when young people start seeing other young people, when people of color start seeing other people of color involved, then the population will grow.
I think that is brilliant and perfect. Thank you all so very, very much. Andrew, Cara, Ms. Nutter, thank you all so much for your time and for sharing just your expertise and your just world of work with all of us. I know our participants really enjoy seeing you today and hearing your stories. I would like to also, before I turn it over, just thank again Pennsylvania for State Archives, Mr. Carmichael, Tyler, Cindy, Josh, thank you all so much for inviting all of us to be here today. We just are so honored to be sharing this with you, and for you to be sharing with us, and for the work that all of you are doing across the state, and with just advocating and shepherding records in Pennsylvania in the way that you've been doing. So thank you so much. And I will turn it over at this point. Thank you all and have a great day.
Thank you, Dominique. Thank you all.
Yeah, we want to thank you all too, Andrew and Jane and Cara and Dominique, for your work on this. I think it was a fabulous, fabulous session. So with that, we'd like to say goodbye, and we appreciate you spending the afternoon with us. Thank you.
Thank you all again.
Okay, I think that's it.
That's everybody.
Perfect. All right, that went very well. We're all very happy with how that went.
Good, good. That was fun.
Yeah.
I will be signing up for that walking tour. I actually wasn't joking.
Yeah. Oh. Yeah, so why? Cindy, you're muted right now. There you go.
Thank you.
Okay. So